One of the questions that always perplexes me with knitting is when someone says, how much yarn will it take to knit a man's sweater? There's so many unanswered questions. What weight of yarn, what size of man, what style of sweater, what kind of stitch pattern? And I believe that many of the figures that you see written down in tables are literally conjured out of thin air. I mean, with a basis of some knowledge, but at best they're a guess. So you can take charge of your swatching life by making your own yarn estimate. Whether it's a scarf, whether it's a sweater, you can use this same principle for anything. And it really truly is your very own calculation, because it's the needles you're using, the yarn you're using, the stitch pattern you're using, everything about it is unique to you, and it's your gauge as well. So let's have a look how we can make a very simple estimation of how much yarn we need for a scarf. So we do it from first principles. The first thing we need to do is to weigh the swatch. I firmly believe every knitter should own a pair of digital scales. They're not terribly expensive these days and they're well worth the investment. Get a pair that weighs to 1/10 of a gram if you possibly can. But even to the nearest gram is good enough. This swatch weighed 12 grams and I deducted the weight of the knitting needle. So that was just the yarn. I've got a little tail left, but better to err on the side of generosity. But the swatch weighs 12 grams. And then we'll measure it. I still find inches more convenient, so I've considered this swatch to be 3 inches tall and 5 inches wide. I could be more specific and say 5 1/4, but let's just call it 5 for ease of calculation. This is all you need to do to work out your yarn amount that you will need for your project. We'll talk in terms of the scarf and then we'll think about other shapes later. So the swatch weight was 12 grams. The swatch size, we measured it, it's 3 by 5, which is 15 square inches. And this is another good use for your swatch. So if we take the weight of the swatch and divide it by the area, 15 square inches, that we find out that each square inch of this scarf is using 0.8 of a gram of yarn. The planned scarf size. I looked at my swatch and said, well, I actually would like my scarf to be 1 pattern repeat wider. So I added 1.5 inches. So I want my width of my scarf to be 7.5. And I put a tape measure around my neck and decided that 30 seemed like a sensible length for my scarf. We multiply those two figures and we get an area for your scarf of 225 square inches. We know how much 1 square inch weighs, therefore 225 will give you a figure of 180 grams. And so I would say to myself, well, 100 grams of each yarn will be just lovely. I'm leaving something in reserve. I've got a very accurate estimate, and it's mentioned in the pattern for that particular stitch pattern that you use just a soupçon more of the colour B than you do of colour A. So if you're erring in terms of colour allowance, you're going to want about 90 grams of each and maybe a shade more of colour B. If you're using this same method to estimate a sweater, look at this schematic. Look at the size and shape you plan to knit it to. It's going to be 20 inches wide, it's going to be 22 inches tall. Don't deduct anything for armholes or neck. So basically resolve the shape of the sweater and both the sleeves down to square inches. Remember, there's a back and a front, there's a left sleeve and a right sleeve. And the taper on the sleeves, well, you could just sort of take an average width of the sleeve. Err on the side of being a little bit generous, and then you'll have enough yarn for the bands and for the collar as well. But this way there's no guesswork. It's the real thing you're measuring, it's your knitting, and it'll put you in the driving seat. All you need to do is do your swatch, and now your swatch has yet another function. It's not just size and tension and whether you like the stitch pattern, it's also a way of calculating the amount of yarn you're going to use.